Okay, so we had just about completed Siman Tes, which was talking at the end of the chapter, was talking about all of the requirements that are necessary in order to appoint a dayan. And what we had said is that any dayan that is appointed by the community should not be appointed because of nepotism or because of cronyism or because of certain financial incentives that the person provides, nor are you allowed to appoint someone with the reliance on the fact that if they have even though they're not learned, but if they have a difficult issue, they can always ask someone else. And any dayan who is appointed because they have purchased their way into the position, you're not allowed to honor them in any way, but if anything, you're supposed to deprecate them and in any way show their lack of importance. And of course, the qualification that the Imrei Yaakov provided was that if there's no one else in the community and this person is the best that you got, so then you have to stick with that particular person. So what was attempted to be sort of pointed out is that it's a really like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a responsibility to appoint dayanim who are experts, and we also learned that anyone who is fit to serve does not have a right to demur and to say that I prefer not to because it's going to take away time from my own personal Torah study. But at the same time, no one should allow themselves to be appointed if they know that they're not fit for the job. So with that, we concluded Siman Tes. I don't think we left any loose ends from the commentaries. So what I'd like to do is start Siman Yud today. Dinei Shmiras Haguf V'Nefesh Ubal Tashchas. This is going to be a very interesting chapter. It has to do with the obligation to protect yourself physically, to protect yourself spiritually, and the prohibition of Bal Tashchis. Who can tell me what the prohibition of Bal Tashchis is? Anybody? Don't waste things, don't wantonly destroy things, right? Yeah, okay. And so the Torah's context of Bal Tashchis is to destroy fruit trees just indiscriminately because they can provide you with food. But we'll see that there are limits to Bal Tashchis. But that's all, and also, so those are the topics that we're going to cover in this chapter. So the first thing we're going to see is the obligation that a person has to protect himself, both physically and spiritually. And so the first halacha that we're going to see is the halacha of ma'akeh. What is a ma'akeh? It's translated as a parapet, that you have an obligation to build a protective guard on your rooftop so that people, neither yourself nor others, will fall off the roof. That's within the purview of our discussion, that you have to do things to protect yourself. So mitzvat aseh la'asos adam ma'akeh legago. It is a positive commandment for a person to build a ma'akeh on his rooftop. Shenamar ve'asisa ma'akeh legagecha. As it says, you shall make a parapet for your rooftop. Vehu sheyihiyeh beis dira. That's provided that the rooftop is used for dwelling. Aval beis haknesses ubeis hamedrash ubeis haotzar ubeis habakar ve'hateben. But if let's say you have a structure that has a rooftop that does not have dwelling utility, such as a synagogue, right? A beis medrash, a beis haotzar, a warehouse, beis habakar, a barn, which would either store cattle or straw, piturim. Those structures are exempt from a parapet. And the reason is she'ein regilus klal lihishtamesh al gagehen, because people don't use. It's not normal for a person to go up and to use the roof. The only time that people will go up to the rooftop on those structures is, let's say, to repair the roof, right? So, like right now, we have scaffolding on the sides of our roof because we have people working on our rooftop. I think the scaffolding is still there. I think it is. But the reason for the scaffolding is because temporarily the workers probably are obligated for insurance purposes to put scaffolding to make sure that if anyone would accidentally get too close to the edge, that there would be something to catch them. I recently watched the documentary Let It Be that was made about the Beatles, and their last that was their almost their last album, and they recorded it on a rooftop of Abbey Road Studios. For those of you who were living in a cave back then or are too young to remember, they did it on a rooftop. They recorded Let It Be on most of Let It Be. They recorded on a rooftop. And I noticed that they too had some kind of it frightens me. I'm a little bit scared of heights. So, but they had some kind of protective structure around the roof there also to some degree or another. Okay. Okay. Anyway, so V'lachein gagin shalanu piturim. And that's the reason why our rooftops, meaning our rooftops in medieval Eastern Europe, are exempt from a parapet because we don't use our rooftops. B'chol bayis she'ein bo daled amos al daled amos, mipnei she'eino ro'i lidira ve'ein shem bayis alav. So any structure that it does not have 4 by 4 amos in size will also be exempt from a parapet because it's not usable as a living space and it doesn't have the status of a house. Because the Torah says, make a structure make a ma'akeh for the rooftop of your house, right? So, and since these structures are so small that they don't have that requisite size, they're going to be exempt. Okay, so that's the end of Sif Aleph. Let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Lasos Adam Ma'akeh, that you have to make a parapet, and the Imrei Yaakov says you make a bracha on that as well when you build the parapet. It says Umavarech Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav b'tzivanu la'asot ma'akeh. Right, so that's the bracha. You know, when you sanctified us with His commandments and told us that we have to build a parapet. Avol birka shehechiyanu eino mevarich, but you don't make a shehechiyanu on building a ma'akeh. The im acher, I guess it's not because it's probably because it's not a celebratory act, right? It's just that you have an obligation once you have a house to build a parapet. The im acher oseh hamakeh, bevarich haoseh al asiyat ma'akeh. And if you hire someone else to do it, that person also has to make a bracha, but he says asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav b'tzivanu al asiyat ma'akeh, because he's not the homeowner, so he wasn't directly commanded, but he's commanded over the making of a ma'akeh. B'tov sheyimaneh oto shaliach, and it's proper to appoint him as your proxy, and that way, you know, you have a greater association to the performance of the mitzvah. Okay, Adam ma'akeh ve'ein chiluk bein ish leisha dehareza mitzvah saseh shelo hazman grama. There's no difference whether you're a man or a woman. Just like a woman also has to put a mezuzah on her house, so too a woman has to build a parapet. V'od deharei ikabo nami lo saseh shelo sasim damim b'veisecha k'dolakaman siv gimel. As we'll see in Sif Gimel, there's also a negative commandment associated to this mitzvah, because the Torah first speaks in the positive, you shall make a parapet for your rooftop, but then the very next words of the pasuk are, Do not place blood on your house if someone shall fall off your roof. So, because it words it in a negative way, all women are included in all negative commandments. The next point he makes is that if a house is jointly owned, then both partners have a joint obligation to build a parapet. Let's say you own a building in joint partnership with a Gentile. So then there's a machlokes whether or not the building is obligated in a parapet, and therefore the poskim say you are mechayev to build one because it's a safek deoraisa, but you don't make a bracha when you put it up. I was just in downtown Miami last week, and these huge, tall buildings, all of them use their rooftops, and they have multiple rooftops. And all of the rooftops have obviously very large walls, thankfully. Okay. Base dira, it has to be meant for occupancy, for dwelling, the rooftop. Furthermore, it has to be a certain height. In other words, let's say you have a building which most of the building is underground, goes below ground level, and it only goes up 1 story or even less than 1 story. So at what height is it obligated in Makkah? So he writes that it has to be 10 tfachim high. How much is 10 tfachim? It's about 40 inches. But if it's less than 40 inches, so then you're exempt from a ma'akeh. But if it's not meant for dwelling, such as let's say it's a synagogue or the like, where people don't normally use the roof, then it's exempt from a ma'akeh. And he says, "Va'af im lefa'amim yikred diyadur shamadam." He says, and even though occasionally a person might go up there for dwelling purposes, mikol makom ein yotzim v'nichnasim kol kach sham lemecha sheipol misham lihitzarich ma'akeh. But if it's not a regular occurrence, there's less of a concern that people will fall off the roof, and therefore you're exempt from the parapet. Ulam imhu matsui shemishtamshim al gag beita otzaro beita bakar. But if it's a regular occurrence that people do use the rooftop of, let's say, a warehouse, maybe they use the top of the warehouse, let's say, for drying goods. A lot of times, let's say, if it's a hot climate, they may have goods that need to be dried out, like raisins or things like that, dried fruit, and they would use it put it on the rooftop. And that would be for an industrial use. So you would be obligated in a ma'akeh, tzarech lasos ma'akeh v'lo yivarech aleha, but you don't make a bracha on it, says the Chazon Ish, because the original takana was only for residences. It's the same thing with mezuzah, by the way. You're obligated to put a mezuzah on your office, but you don't make a bracha on it. And he writes, "V'lachein gagin shalanu piturim." He says, therefore, our rooftops are exempt. Aval gagos shemishtamshim imohim l'shtichas begodim achar hakibus oleishev sham bekayetz lishov aviru chedome vaday chayavim. He says, if you have a rooftop that you use regularly for, let's say, hanging your laundry after you wash them, or let's say to sit out in the summer to get some fresh air, you put some lawn chairs up on your rooftop, then obviously those types of utilities make you obligated in a makeh. And those who are lenient have no one upon whom they may rely. I'm thinking, of what, those old movies where, people in Brooklyn or the Bronx, where they would go up to their rooftop, up on the roof. Isn't there a song like that? This old world starts getting me down. So it's you go up on the roof, right? And they didn't have parapets in Brooklyn or the Bronx. So, but they would just go up on the roof, and people would have birds up there, and they'd have grow their plants up there. But those structures, if they are used for utility, you have to build a parapet. And then finally, she'ein bo dalet amos, that if they don't have, if the structure is less than 4 by 4 amos, which is maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, 2 meters by 2 meters, he says it's exempt. If, however, let's say it's not 6 by 6, it's not 4 by 4 amos, but let's say it's 6 amos or 8 amos by 2 amos, right? So you have the same square footage, but just in an oblong shape. You're still obligated in a parapet, but you should put it up without a bracha, he says. Okay. Okay. Now, let me just see if there's any Imrei, any of the Biurim over here. Okay, let's take a look at the Biurim over here. Ma'akel gago. He says, "B'sefer maram shik al taryag mitzvahs mitzvah tavkuf mem zayin kasav zelashana. V'lanias daiti nira mitzvahs ma'akehu b'chol ofan. Afilu im enu rotze l'shamesh al hagag." The Maram Shik, who lives in the 19th century, writes that it seems to me that you are obligated in the mitzvah of ma'akeh, even if your plan is not to use the rooftop. Afilu hachi mitzvah hu alav shiyasa ma'akeh al gago. Nevertheless, you have an obligation to put a parapet around your roof. Aval mitzvahs ma'akeh hu afilu lo ya'aleh al gago la'olam ad kan l'shana. And that's true even if you end up never going up on your roof. So that's a big chiddush, because we just learned that it has to be a rooftop that's meant for dwelling. And that's why the Rav Stern writes, "Aval lanios daiti nira dedas kama poskim enu kidbarahu chidla kaman." But it seems like that's not the consensus of most of the poskim. He says, "The ayin bebir halacha simen tafkuf mem sif aleph shekasa b'divrei amaschol v'chenim asamake v'zilashona." He says the Bir Halacha writes that he says, "Ayin b'chidushay haritva shekasav demasnisim mari begag delo ragili lahaloch bo she'enu chayev b'makeh ad kan l'shono." He says that when a rooftop is not regularly used for dwelling, then it's exempt from makeh. So you see that if you don't plan on using your roof, then you're exempt. He writes as follows: He writes that our rooftops are putter from building a parapet. Since we don't regularly use them. Etc., etc. Who writes, he writes as follows: let's say a person buys a new house and he doesn't have any plan to occupy the house for some time. And only when he begins occupancy does he plan to use the roof. Does he have the mitzvah to build a parapet right away? Or does the obligation to build a parapet only start once he takes occupancy? V'ra'isi lahagon balderech amuna b'sifro parsha sidur al maseches mezuzah shekasav u'b'sifri parshas kitzeitze gabi maka dorish bayis chadash mishas chidusho v'nira dehakavana gam ken tekev shebeno yesh lo likvo maka afshalo nichnas adayin ladurbo ad kan l'shana. And he writes, that he quotes from the Sefer that says that if a person builds a new house, then the obligation to build the makeh begins immediately, as soon as the house goes up. even before he's taken occupancy. But he says, I'm not sure that I agree with that. He doesn't talk about mezuzah. He's writing on Maseches mezuzah, but he's not specifically addressing mezuzah over here. But he is saying that it would seem to me this particular sefer that that you become obligated on building a makeh once you build a new house. Omnam lanias daiti yesh makom ladun bazeh. But he says, but that's not so clear from this the Sifri Midrash that he's quoting. Because there, if you look at the language, it goes on the word bayit chadash, when you build a new house. So Rebbe Omer mishat chidusho aselo ma'akeh. Because the Medrash says that according to Rebbe, from the time that it becomes new, you have to build it a parapet. Because of Sham Hamalbim Vizal, Vizelishono, Mashakos of Chadash Hulamosar, Ubalomer Shetekav Kishatirtze Lechadesh Habayit, Tzarich Sheta'asem Ma'akeh V'chulei Ad Kam Lashon. So the Malbim understands that as soon as you wish to renew the house, you need to build a parapet. Arei dehevin the Perish HaSifr Mishat Chidusho Hanu Mizman Shirotze Ladur B'Bayit U'Lechadsho. What the Malbim understands from the Sifri is that the obligation to build a parapet is from the moment of the renewal of the house. What does the renewal of the house mean? So the Malbim understands that it means from the time that you wish to occupy it. Virak oz chayev b'makeh. V'pashtut mistaver lo markein, and it really makes sense to say that. The im nefarish b'sifri the kavanot with the miyad b'gmar habayit yesh kvar chayev makeh. He says, because if we were to understand to the contrary, that once you build the house, you're obligated to put up a makeh. And if you don't, you're in violation of the mitzvah. He says, but what about the fact that if I live in a house already, but I'm not planning to use my rooftop, I'm exempt from makeh. So certainly if I haven't taken occupancy of the house, I should be exempt from makeh when no one's there. He says, and that's what it seems like from the Shita Mekubetzet that I've quoted as well. Omnam, however, Achar zeraiti bigdolei hektish yoredeis in reish pehesiv kadn aleph shehevi lechelak merishon svirlei demiyad shenivna habayit ikachti of ma'akeh ayin sham b'tzarachim. However, he says, I note that there is a significant posek from the Sefer Gedolei Hektish that says, brings from earlier commentaries who opine that as soon as you build a new house, you are obligated to put up a ma'akeh. And therefore, he says, I have to end up with a tzarach iyun, which is, this needs further analysis. I'm not really sure what the final halacha is, he says. On the one hand, logic would dictate that you're not obligated to build a parapet until you actually take occupancy of the house. But there seems to be a series of opinions that suggest that once you build the house, you build a new house that has a rooftop that has occupancy potential, then you have an obligation to build a parapet. So because it's not clear, I end off with a tzarachim. But obviously the best thing would be that if you are building a structure that is meant for occupancy and there is a plan for people to use the roof, then the best thing to do would be to build a parapet, some kind of wall or fence around the roof to make sure that everyone remains safe. Okay.
Yes. Rabbi, would this also involve a balcony? Patio somebody has?
Yeah, presumably so. Any part of your house that is above 10 tfachim off the ground, where a person will use it for utility, and there's a potential for falling off, yeah, you'd have to build something on your balcony. So clearly. I'll go even further, and perhaps maybe we'll see this in the halacha, I'm not sure. But let's say you have, we'll have to learn the parameters of how high the parapet has to be, let's say it's made of bars, how close the bars have to be to each other. Let's say you build a parapet, but a child could still squeeze through the bars, right? So you probably have not fulfilled your obligation if a small child could fall off, God forbid, fall off. It's like everyone's nightmare, right? So you have to be sure that you build the parapet appropriately to protect people from falling off. So we'll learn how high the parapet has to be and so forth as we go through this halacha. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
another, I don't know if it would fall into this category, and actually staying with the sort of music analogy you brought with the Beatles. I remember years ago, Eric Clapton, he had a little son that fell through the window of his building and plunged
In
many
New York,
floors
yeah.
to his death. Yeah, and
Terrible tragedy.
Sorry.
Terrible tragedy.
Yeah, and it actually happened here in Thornhill or around the corner from us many years ago. I remember this couple had a son that fell out through the bedroom window and unfortunately died too. So would that fall in the same category here of not having a screen on your window?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure whether it's we'd have to examine carefully whether there's a mitzvah aseh, a positive commandment, to build barriers on your windows. It doesn't seem like it. Children are not meant to be climbing up on beds or chairs or things like that. But obviously, if you have a bed that's right near a window, and the window doesn't have a screen, then obviously you're doing something unsafe, right? I don't know whether you can say that it halachically falls within the same guidelines or parameters or not. But obviously, the whole function of this mitzvah is to protect people from falling from high places. And so you should take the proper precautions no matter where you live, right? Yes, and also screens aren't always the protection that we think they are. A child reaches a certain weight. If they lean on the screen could be pushed out. And so that's always, my wife's nightmare, even more than mine. Because the bed is next to the window and the window's open and the screen and, maybe the screen will pop out, all of these fears that are the greatest, the things that keep you up at night. Yeah, the story with Clapton's kid is that the window was just open and it was a floor to ceiling window. And the kid just ran and just wasn't even aware of what was happening. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. Yeah. Okay. So I think what we'll do is we'll hold it here for today and we will pick it up in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow will be our last day of learning for a couple of weeks. So I'm going away. So we'll continue this tomorrow and then we'll take a break. All right. So have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay.